Hey everybody, take a look at the position that I've put in front of you. It's white's turn to move, and believe it or not, checkmate in 7 moves. Now I know, you can't checkmate using just your knight. Or can you? This study is from Dvoretskys Endgame Manual, which is also known as the absolute hardest book in chess ever written. So, can you checkmate in this position playing white? What is your first move here? Well, if you're thinking king to f2, trying to limit the black king's available squares to only these two, h1 and h2, unfortunately, that's the wrong answer. You had the right idea in mind, but that's not how you're going to have to do it here. The black king is just going to move to h1, and now what? If you play knight to g3, black is just going to go back to h2. Knight to f1 check, black is just going to shuffle between h1 and h2, and eventually going to draw by repetition. But what if you try to reroute the knight and move it to e4? King moves to h1, knight to d2. King to h2, knight to f1. King to h1, and then we're back at square one, unfortunately. So moving the knight to h5 would have the same outcome as knight to e4. King moves to h1, knight moves to f4, pawn to h2, and black is just going to turn it into a stalemate next turn. Now, king to g3 is not going to be an option either, because black is just going to push the pawn to h2, and black is once again going to initiate a stalemate. But what if you move the king to f1 instead of the knight to g3? Would this balance things out in white's favor? Sadly, no. This move would also just lead to a draw. Black again would end up shuffling between h1 and h2, and he's just never going to end up pushing that pawn. Now, as you guys can already see, rerouting the knight is just going to be pointless, because after knight to c3, black is going to play king to g3 over here and escape from that corner. In this scenario, black's only purpose is to draw the game, so he's gladly going to sacrifice his pawn to achieve that. King moves to g1, pawn to h2 check. King moves to h1, and now black is just going to wander around the board. Now, after learning the principle behind it, this is a rather easy puzzle. The point is to checkmate with the knight on g3 and the king on f2, and for that, white needs to force black to put the king on h1 and this pawn on h2. Now, knowing that, it's really easy to work out the solution backwards. The only tricky part is that in this particular position, you're going to need to lose a tempo first. Now, this is why king to f2 doesn't work, because white wouldn't lose that tempo. Well, now that I've said that, I'm going to leave you guys a couple seconds to see if you can come up with the right sequence of moves here. Alright, ready? If you said knight to f4, well, I'm very sorry to say this to you, but that's also going to be the wrong move here. Now, why is that? It's because black could escape from that corner with king to g3, and we need the king to stay on the h1 square for that checkmate. Now, with him on g3, we have no way of forcing him back in there. So, black is going to give up the pawn and save the game for himself. Oh, I see. I need to lose a tempo, so I need to bring the knight back, right? No, this is not what I mean by losing a tempo, because we can see once again that the black king can just escape from that corner if we do that. Now, tempo in chess means time. It's basically just a turn in chess. Losing a tempo means losing a move, while winning a tempo means gaining move. So, think about developing a knight in the opening by attacking the enemy queen. Here, let me show you. This is called winning a tempo, because black now needs to move his queen if he wants to keep it. So white developed the knight for free. Now back to our actual position. We see that when we move the king to f2 first, white can't force black to push his pawn because the enemy king could shuffle between h1 and h2. So if we tried to use the knight to block those squares, we would have ended the game in a stalemate. This is why white needs to waste a tempo here, or waste a move. Because if he starts one move later, when the knight would move to f1, that would not be a check because the enemy king would already be on h1. So, black would be forced to move the pawn to h2, and after that pawn move, knight to g3 would solidify that checkmate. Now, how would white end up achieving this? We see that we can't start with the knight because black is just going to escape that corner. The white knight does a very good job of attacking the g3 and the g1 squares. This is why the correct move here is going to end up being king to f3. Because black can't escape through g1 because of the knight, so black is forced to move to h1, and now white can just play king to f2, arriving on the f2 square when the enemy king is also on the h2 square and not on h1. Now, white just needs to find the correct knight path to avoid a stalemate, meaning that his knight should be on f1 when the black king is on h1. Alright, so the theory sounds fairly easy, right? But it's the practice that unfortunately kills us. We can't start with knight g3 because that's going to end the game in a stalemate. So what other routes can the knight take? Well, basically, you can start from wherever square you want. All the knight moves are winning here. You got g1, you got f4, it really doesn't matter. What matters is to just be very careful not to stalemate, because black still has a very small trick up his sleeve. You can't just blindly move the knight trying to reach that f1 square. Because let's say we move the knight to f4, black goes to h1, and now can you see how black can draw this from this position? If white makes a random knight move, let's say to d5, black is going to play pawn to h2. White can't move his king now because that move is going to cost him a game. So he's forced to move the knight, thus resulting in the unfortunate stalemate. White needs to be really careful to jump to g3 if black ever decides to push that pawn. This is going to really help us limit all possible routes that we need to calculate. Now we see from the start that the only squares where the knight can jump to are g3, h5, and e2, while all the others, like d5 and d3, those are losing squares. Now, knowing all of that, let's try to find the winning path. A simple way to do that is just to count the knight movements and compare them to black's movements. Now the quick challenge for you guys, pause the video, count the moves, and see if you can choose the correct path starting from either h5 or e2. A quick hint for you here, when you're calculating where the black king is going to be, you need to calculate with one move less because white is going to be the first to play. So if white ends up needing 5 turns to reach this f1 square, you need to calculate where the black king is going to be on the 4th move, because we want the 5th move for black to be the pawn push to h2. So we can deliver that checkmate on g3. Now if the white knight requires 3 moves to reach f1, you need to calculate where the enemy king is going to be after 2 turns. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. And I hope you found the winning path. Now let's show it to everybody. I'd like to show you the wrong path first because I think it's important to explain why certain moves don't work. I don't really want to be that guy that just tells you, play this move because it's the correct move. You know, you have the engine for that. So let's explore the incorrect path first. Okay, so let's count knight to e2 as 1 move, knight to g3 is 2 moves, knight to f1 is 3 moves. Now we got to calculate where the enemy king is going to be after 2 moves. So we have h2 as the first move and h1 as the second move. It's exactly where we wanted him to be, right? If you chose that path, unfortunately, that's the wrong path, and the game is going to end in a stalemate. Now I said we need to be careful not to stalemate, and this is exactly what we did. Now after knight to e2, king moves to h2. Knight to g3 would be that stalemate. So we need to find another route. If it's hard to visualize it all in your head, you can draw arrows to help, but I suggest you try and develop this important skill because being able to visualize it in your head, it really helps. Because let's say if you're playing on a mobile platform or a platform that doesn't have this feature, like a real life tournament, you won't be able to just draw arrows all over the board. So it's an important tactic to try and practice. So let's try it this way without arrows and say the moves out loud. We've got knight to c3. Black would move to h1. Now be careful. When the black king is on h1, he can play pawn to h2 and draw the game. So white needs to find a square for his knight to checkmate on g3. The knight is on c3. Where should we move the knight now so that he could jump to g3 if needed? That's right, we're going to go to e4. So black moves to h2. Now we don't really need to worry about him pushing the pawn. So let's recap. Our knight is on e4 and the king is now on h2. So where do we move? I really hope you said d2 and not g3 because g3 would end the game in a stalemate. So knight moves to d2, king moves to h1, and we finally arrive with our knight on f1 and the black king is on h1. Black is now forced to play pawn to h2 and we deliver the most impossible and hardest mate ever with knight to g3. Now, let's see if our calculation was in fact on point. We've got knight to c3, king to h1. Knight to e4, king to h2. Knight to d2, king to h1. Knight to f1, pawn to h2, and checkmate. Wow, alright, what a ride. Did you ever think that you would just be checkmating with solely your knight? Now, if you said before that that was impossible, now you've got a new achievement to unlock. I think it's a lot more satisfying and a lot smoother a mate. Now, let me know if you managed to deliver a checkmate like this in the comments Take care, and we'll see you in the next video.